What if the Exodus didn't happen during Egypt's golden age, but rather after the world had already collapsed? Around 1200 BCE, civilizations all across the Mediterranean began to fall. Droughts, famine, earthquakes, foreign invaders, climate disasters. The whole thing with the sudden collapse of an extensive trade network just gone. Entire cities vanished, empires crumbled, chaos took reign. Survival became the only option, so certain countries had to adapt. New countries then emerged. And a famous story comes out of this, one with plague, slavery, escape, and the salvation of the nomadic peoples, just trying to find their way in this new and foreign world, escorted, guided, and protected by divine judgment, intervention, and redemption. Welcome to Chasing the Past, guys. Today, we are going to explore whether the Exodus was written as recorded history or as a memory of survival born after the Bronze Age collapse. What's up, guys? This one is fun, and I know I promised you the Sea People. I know I did. That one got complicated because I finished Eric's book, 1177. Great book, by the way. Loved it. Definitely go pick it up. I mean, I was surprised, to be honest with you. It flows better. I thought I was going to read a history book, and it felt like I was reading this cohesive, flowing story with all his points. And without knowing it, I got the second edition he did with more scholarship pages at the end, I think, and maybe some edits inside the chapters. Either way, now I have a ton of notes on the Sea People that I have to go back into and then change the notes because it kind of has a shift of view. So that one coming up, but I had to kind of redo the whole thing. And the one in between, I was going to put this one after, but I figured this one was good, which is how the Late Bronze Age developed Israelite culture, the Exodus, and how this became kind of the story. And so, we're going to do a quick, LBA collapse. I have a video, I'll put the little tag thing right here, that went over that. Then we're going to go through, Egypt as a country and how they handled the Late Bronze Age. Then, kind of I think it's important. I think the evidence is important, right? Let's just go through both. And so we have the evidence section, then we have the figure of Moses himself, some of the problems with recorded histories in this time period. Then, a quick overview of different, authorship potentials, new models, the whole shebang. And then get to the end where you see some of the tie-ins between these Late Bronze Age issues that causes collapse and this Exodus story that then kind of holds this memory in shape. Now, in doing this, I realized I'm not trying to take it out of how important the story is, whether you're Jewish or not, Christian or not, right? It's an amazing story that is still fun to read and has, depth to it. And even in the New Testament, you get references to this great journey and this transformation that gets put into the New Testament. So we're going to go through all those and then get this cool final synthesis of, what we can know, what we can understand, and figure out from there. So the fun part in the first section here was I was trying to figure out, the basic time periods and if there's a scholarship, idea. Because everyone knows, Ramses II, and you can date it around that same period of time during his reign. So the consensus was it's more of like a theological response to this chaos that ensues in the collapse. So everything goes under, things start happening, and it's super confusing, right? No one knows what's going on. Giant places that were, the superpowers of the time just crumbled in on itself. And everyone's in a panic, a mad rush. It's just chaos ensues. And the thing that I thought was important was, remember the time period, because the entire world at the time in this Mediterranean area, the whole thing's falling apart, right? Everything is collapsing, and so that is your backdrop for the Exodus story. And just a brief overview of the Bronze Age, right? This collapse. You have the mega droughts, right? I think in the book, it's like 150 to 300 years of this mega drought. I'm pretty sure. Again, I was supposed to put that in here. I did not. But I remember that because I go, that's a long time. Like, that's a long time. Yeah, no wonder they didn't recover. That's a long time. So you have the mega droughts. Those then lead to famine because crop failure, right? And then we have measurements of extreme earthquakes at the time. So those things, then there's a big trade network between all these different civilizations. Again, I'll try to find the chart and put it in here that I found from reading Eric's book. And, that trade network, that where they can, and this was something too, where in archaeological records we have, letters from kings of, the Hittites, and then they're talking to the Egyptians, and they're like, hey, we need more grain. Like, we are starving. This is life or death. And they can't even keep up with it because they're also going through the same period. It's happening everywhere. And so these trade networks then fall apart, or ships get lost, or, just terrible things start happening to the overall structure of the Mediterranean. And that ensues these foreign invaders, sea peoples, honestly, people trying to just survive, collecting together. I'm right into Pirates of the Caribbean, to be honest. They're like, oh, we're going to go and do this, and we'll just take that because if we don't, we die, right? That is the mentality. And so what happens is that leaves these cities all over the Levant area just abandoned. And, they just never recover until much later, where other people settle. And so, to me, when I was reading that, it definitely seemed like the imagery in the backdrop for this Exodus story. So I just put some down, like darkness is a good theme, right? Hunger, right? People are wandering everywhere, right? It's confusing, right? There's social displacement now, right? Oh, the systems didn't work. And then this divine judgment, this language of like, see, you guys had it coming for you, right? This is all your fault, right? God did this, God did that. And so instead of these like miracles, if you want, like miracle stories, miracle-esque divine judgments, to me it's reminiscent, I guess, of like people remembering this disaster. Like, what did we overcome? Which is still a powerful tool. We use that now with modern stories as well. It's why we relate to it so much. And at the time, Egypt was falling apart during the Bronze Age. So I put the not so stable superpower in this Exodus story because it's seen as this great place and all this stuff. But even at the time, they're falling apart, right? They have grain shortages like we talked about themselves. There are labor revolts, right? Like strikes. I'm not going to do that. There's instability at their own borders, right? So then you get this loss of like, okay, we can't control all this stuff, so we have to lose some, and that involves the land of Canaan, right? So all that culminates together with this, hate to bring it up so quick, it's only been like, 8 minutes or something, but it means that we can use these for the Exodus records, right? So we have no Egyptian records of millions of Hebrew slaves leaving, coming in. We have no record of Moses and no evidence of any mass departure and wandering of these people. So I had to break them down so I can give it to you. And again, I know I make mistakes. So if there's anything that you hear that I am mistaken on, please comment down there. I just want to know more, right? So from what I found, there's a very clear scholarship point, right? We have the massive migration traces that we do not find in the Sinai region, right? There's nothing, right? You would definitely find something there if millions. I think the number I saw was 600,000, but if you factor in the women and the children, then well over 1 million, right? You would definitely find something. But we have no campsites, no pottery, no artifacts that are consistent with any of this mass migration. And so the other part was the Red Sea, which I found interesting because I always thought like, oh, the Red Sea. Nope. It means Sea of Reeds, which, why isn't that talked about more? I mean, that's a pretty important one, right? A big the sea parts, or the Sea of Reeds, which is just this shallowy marsh. Usually reference in the Nile Delta, right? But definitely not the deep Gulf waters. So that puts a little damper on the story of like how the sea parts itself. Moving on. Again, no Egyptian records of like this cataclysm, right? That would be to the entire region, right? Of this mass migration of them leaving, or even the death of all the people in Egypt, right? There would be something. They'd be like, oh my God. Like, because again, from what I read from Eric's book and from just papers on Egypt's record keeping, right? They were pretty good. So there are no monumental inscriptions or records detailing specifically, like, the 10 plagues, death of the firstborn, and, this massive Hebrew migration. So the evidence shows more likely that this early Israelite group, or this like subsect group, has Canaanite origins for sure. So less Egypt, more Canaanite. And I'm going to go through these individually, but we have pottery, settlement patterns, their language, the writing system, religious practices, and dietary practices, right? All of these point towards a Canaanite origin and a group inside rather than this, divine group in Egypt moving out of it, because they would pull something from it, So we'll start with pottery, right? There is nothing unique that comes from this pottery. So I think it was like on the rim. Egyptians, they did this cool like decorative rim on the outside, something. But either way, these early Israelite settlements that we find, they're pretty simple, right? Undecorated, like just firmly, at least in tradition, Canaanite. Settlements, same thing. There's a distinct, I didn't know this, but there's a distinct 4-room house design, right? Used to be this Israelite hallmark. That's more of a local tradition from Canaanite homes. So we have, which I think is interesting that we can do this now, is amazing. You can excavate an area, figure out the levels, and then work through a time period from the bottom up. And so you still get this layout of this 4-room house design. And it's like, okay, this one's Canaanite. And you go, whoa, okay, that's Israelite. Kind of the same. So that's unique. And of course, the most simple one is the Hebrew language uses early Canaanite alphabet. So it uses the alphabet and the system to develop the early Hebrew writings. And I didn't know about the religious practices or the dietary practices, but dietary, right? There's an absence of pig bones at early Israelite sites. And, that used to be a very clear Jewish, don't eat pork, don't eat pig, right? Canaanites didn't eat it either. So another tradition there. And of course, there is in Exodus itself where the Israelites are going to, it reminds me of the golden calf, right? They're doing things that are not in this framework of this new religious system. And to me, that always was like, well, they had to have known it then, right? Because if it's just them in the middle of nowhere and they're just making shit up, so, pardon my French, they're just making stuff up, right? I'm doing, side note, but I'm trying to do this cool thing for my kiddo where I'm writing like like a Lord of the Rings book. Do you know how hard it is to try to pull something that doesn't exist already, or like use it a little bit? Like I really sat there for a while and tried, and I'm like, screw it. I'm gonna take that little thing I know, put it in here. There you go. Right? That's what's happening. So these early religious practices and like figures, right, they overlap with this Canaanite pantheon. The difference that makes this group, should be clear by now, is this Yahweh figure. And, it seems like that evolved from this Canaanite pantheon, and then they picked the one rather than the entire pantheon. But the practices still have the same kind of overlap. And so instead of the data pointing to like this rare thing, this rare group getting some divine, knowledge and this leading them through this big sea, it's more of like a social revolution in this case, I guess, right? Like this process of settling down, like a early Israelite group with maybe a mix of like the disenfranchised or the people who aren't doing so well, right? This nomadic peoples who were like, hey, we do not like this city-state system. we need to shake it up a bit. And then this is all happening, and they were like, this might be our shot. We might be able to do that. People are starving, right? But the date, which is important to tie it into the late Bronze Age, is what is it, Iron Age 1? First something, yeah. Like 1200 to 1000 BCE, right? Is when this social revolution kicked off. The book's 1177 because that's like middle ground for dating of this big collapse. So the date is important. So even though it might not be this like literal history, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have something to give. The story has something to offer a group, right? These stories tie us together, tie us to one another, and allow us to, build something that we've never done before, or take a chance a little bit, right? So the bigger, clues is like, all right, how specific can I get with authorship of Exodus with, is my camera going bad? Nope, it still got me. Okay. Sorry, maybe it's the glasses. I didn't even think about that. But the blue light was giving me a little bit of a headache. So I always wondered, right, if there's no record of this mass migration, which also means no mention of this Moses figure. And so, nothing in Egyptian records, nothing in Near Eastern text. It just was something that always kind of bugged me, and I never got good answers. And now it makes a little more sense after going through these. So again, this Exodus story probably didn't get necessarily written, I would say, but it's a story that you can tell the group and you can tie them together. So then the writing comes later. Again, we discussed building it from the Canaanite alphabet and taking some of these traditions that and then making something for this new period of time, this new peoples. And so again, the agreed upon date, again, I can't really say that because I found multiple models on how to date this thing, but at least the beginning, right? First millennium BCE, right? In its current form, that's where you get it, right? And then, of course, you get it started to be compiled later, but the strong evidence points to 8th to 6th century BCE. And then later on, during or after the Babylonian exile, you get the, compiling of all these texts. Now, I wanted to do the quick overview of something called the documentary hypothesis. And I do understand from what I looked up, like, it is considered a bit outdated, but the core idea is still what is being used and is the consensus. So the documentary hypothesis is that the Pentateuch, right, the books of Moses, right, they're stitched together from these 4 sources. So you have J, which is the Yahwist, E, which is Elohist, D, Deutero, I knew it every time. If you watch this, right, I've done this 20 episodes, edit the whole thing, whenever I see a word and I get halfway through and I'm like, don't pronounce it wrong, I pause and I anyway, Deuteronomistic or Deuteronomist is another one. P is priestly. So J source, Yahwist, right? Yahweh for God. That is going to from Judah. The E source, Elohist, right? So you get of course, you get Elohim for God, and that's Israel specific, from Israel. Deuteronomy, I did it again. Deuteronomist, right? That's the covenant, the law, right? Linking it usually to like Josiah. Priestly, that's, emphasizes rituals, genealogies, holiness, right? That one, when we said the Babylonian exile, this one, post-exilic period, right? 6th, 5th century BCE. Now, this strict model, right? Again, like I said before, outdated a little bit, considered outdated, but though the core ideas of multiple sources is still the influence, that's still what we're going with. That is the core. It's not one person. Most scholars agree the Pentateuch has multiple authors and traditions. And so not a single one like Moses, but a collection of this, there's a lot of hands involved in this one. So a new model, I haven't looked any of these up. I found these this morning, so I wanted to refine the notes. But there's a supplementary hypothesis and a new documentary hypothesis. So these still suggest the core texts are expanding on these like later editions and then compiled as you go along. So rather than these 4, it gets more complex, to be honest, because now instead of just having these 4 fully independent works that are just merged, right? Now you have all the additions, right? You have the multiple hands who are working on these stories, crafting, the framework for how we're going to do these things. And it just moves beyond the strict JEDP frame. And it just means it has a much more like layered development. But the core idea is still the same. Now, the important part to tie this all in to the late Bronze Age, right? This is all after these events, right? The collapse kind of stabilizes, right? Climate stabilizes, kingdoms reemerge, the ones that made it, and then of course you have this like opportunity for these new ones to form and take shape. Story is a perfect example of how you would use it to craft a narrative and build a people, right? Again, I'm not saying in like a power-hungry way. I'm saying in a way of survival. We made it. Like, how do we, like, and remember the things they're asking themselves, right? It's a memory of this terrible time. And so this, like, memory theology of this collapse, if it's me, I wrote down, why did our world collapse, right? How do we understand this? Why did this happen? Do we need something so we can ensure survival next time? How do we do that? Oh, we got to do what we did this time. We have to collect ourselves, gather, become a group, and then push for all of our survival. And again, there are Exodus motifs that reference, this parallel to the late Bronze Age. You get plagues, right? Clearly it's climate, disease, slavery, right? Economic dependence, right? There's an economic, hate to say it that way, but yeah, like there's an economy in slavery. And again, I'm not going into any, I don't want to say apologetics, but like if we're just looking at the text, the time period, it's kind of hard to justify some of these. Just the idea of lost in the wilderness, right? Like, we're wandering, like we have nowhere to go, right? Refugee displacement is perfect because that's what happened. So then these refugees then become invaders. Maybe they find some abandoned place and they settle there and they can work the land. This divine judgment in Exodus is also their moral framework, right? You get the explanation of like, oh, we made it because we did this thing. That's why we're so, gifted in the sense of everyone else is dying, starving, right? Seeking something, we found that something. So we are special. We have a moral obligation to keep this law. And then, of course, when they get there, you have this promised land. So then, stability after this Bronze Age collapse is then restored. And boom, now you get the rest of what builds, early Israelite culture. And the important part is that it doesn't have to be literal history to have something symbolic, right? It's because then the story becomes crafted later on. And I remember thinking, like, this is a very common and very influential story that then plays into, even, we'll just go general New Testament, because it shows this, like, continuation rather than a contradiction, because they share this. Jesus is Jewish. They share this story. Exodus it's in their blood. This is the story. And so, Jesus then becomes this new Moses figure, right? In the story, Moses rescues Israel from Pharaoh. Okay, Jesus liberates us from the evil of sin and a Satan figure, right? Satan. I don't know why I said it like that. Both of them, they do teachings on the mountain, right? Sermon on the Mount, right? It echoes Sinai, and I'll put some information there. I didn't put a whole lot, but if you're familiar with some of this work, then that makes sense, right? There's also this contradiction, again, with, I won't even go there. We'll just stick with what I put down. Matthew highlights Jesus' return from Egypt, right? It mirrors this Moses story. The wilderness part, testing, temptation, right? Moses led Israel through the wilderness. Jesus was led into the wilderness for 40 days, right? That's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then it becomes about, like, faith, right? It's more about, like, all right, just have faith rather than just, like, complain about it and do nothing. So this struggle in the desert then foreshadows, right? Because their resilience is on faith, on God getting you to the promised land. Jesus is the same thing, relying on God the Father, right? But those also, like, they also contradict one another, because then in Exodus they were also dependent on God for their stuff, but they didn't really have it in their hearts the whole time, right? Back to the golden calf. So it has this contrasting effect with, like, remember this story that's fundamental to us? Jesus is way better than that. He tops that, right? And then there's, of course, this liberation and divine judgment theology where, God hears those that are oppressed. So their faith shows that even God's commitment to justice and freeing those who are enslaved gives hope, right? The people that are, what do you need? Like, they need hope. Reminds me of Dune, actually. And he's like, that's not hope, right? So, which I wish he was still alive. Frank Herbert, I'd love to talk to you. But it sets up this pattern that then leads to this, any of the future liberation. So it's a demonstration of how God liberates people from, I guess, all forms of, I don't want to say sin, but, like, well, it doesn't have to be social. It could be political. It could be spiritual, right? Any of that type of oppression, don't worry. Have faith. God will take care of it. From this story. And, of course, then you get, the Passover. Pretty big deal. The blood of the Passover lamb, right, that saves Israel in Exodus, right, then becomes this blood of the lamb for Jesus, right? So this, baptizing and crossing this new land is like crossing into a new way of life. And again, it's about transformation. So the ultimate story, and then, of course, you have resurrection, right? The escape from sin and death that then references, like, oh, great, just like in the promised land. So this Exodus story becomes the core thing for all that we have after. Yet, it's just a story that is built from collapse, from this terrible memory of how the world fell apart and how do we justify it. This is how. And it's so interesting to see how it ties all together and how you can follow this path. And as a human to a human being right here, looking right at you, it makes sense. Like, I would do that. Like, if I needed to do this, again, I'm no leader, but if I was someone who was like, hey, how do we get this stuff in charge? It's like, we need something that is so strong that it binds us through any difficult situation. This is that story. And then it gets later, things balance out. Things always kind of, turbulence, but then it's never steady, right? Stability, chaos, collapse, rebirth, right? There's this cycle to being a human being. And so when it does even out, it's like confirmation, right? Like, that worked, right? So the collapse then causes at least 3 core things that I'm pulling from, which is this trauma during the Bronze Age collapse. You get your theology, right? The survival and the strength of your people, that gives you identity, right? The memory of this whole thing reaffirms and then builds the story, myth, and structure that allows you as a people to adapt and handle any chaotic trauma then and in the future. It's perfect. It's great. And I think even for someone who isn't, let's just say, religious or Western leaning, if you're reading the story, right, it's not meant to like be this historical fact. It's to remind us of how we can survive and how we can come together and do anything. We can be anything, and we can do that together. And again, I think that's super important. So I know I've said it already, but I'm not trying to do a discrediting of the Exodus, but I think the story becomes more powerful when you acknowledge all of these facts and these information, or the information points, I should say, into this story. And you know what? We have a little bit of time. I'm going to go through one more section of stuff real quick. All right. So part of when I dive into something, yes, I do want to know the scholarship consensus, but also I wanted to learn from, in this case, it's the Bible Archaeological website. I forget what it's called, but I'll link it below here. I have the link. And so I wanted to know where some of these frameworks for, the other side that wouldn't be, maybe the theology side. So the support comes from this 13th century Exodus, which would be, again, because Exodus, I remember this. In the beginning, I'm pretty sure. Let me scroll down. Yeah, it's Exodus 1:11, right? There are references to, names like Pi-Ramses. Why did I say it like that? Looks like Piatum. I'm pretty sure it's Pithom. Yeah. And the Sea of Reeds or Red Sea, which is looks like Yam Suf. But anyway, these locations are the Bilal Lakes that we talked about. So these wetlands. And the cool part is the dating, which is the important part. Both sides of this coin, scholarship and, theological interpretations, still give it a date, which Ramses II. So I found, 1279 to 1213 BCE. And so that's important. Dating's good. It's good to know that we can meet on the middle ground there. So again, I said that already. These capital cities are mentioned in Exodus 1:11. So Pithom, right, the house of Atum, right, referring to the ancient city known in the Hebrew Bible as Pithom. So it places these, at least Pithom, in the eastern delta, which again is relevant to that period of time. So the Hebrew Sea of Reeds, right, is, how did they put it? It's not equivalent, but it's like Egyptian terms. It just means like papyrus marsh. So usually the lakes in the eastern Nile Delta. So the conflict is, okay, unfortunately, there are no chariots in the Red Sea. I'm pretty sure that picture that dude had that I saw, it was a boat steering wheel that had floated down and just took a picture. He didn't even grab it. He didn't even pick it up. He's like, yeah, that should be evidence. There you go. There's a wheel down there. And you go, that's a boat wheel. They're like, no, it isn't. You're like, well, can I see it? No, I left it. You're like, okay, that's a pretty big discovery just to leave. If you did, do you know what I mean? Anyway, so the narrative itself, right? Scholars can place this at the same time, 13th century BCE. So this grand scale exodus described in the Bible likely did not happen, right? Again, we went through all the evidence. It's hard to find any massive Israelite presence relating to this departure. Instead, maybe there's an alternative of a smaller, like historical kernel, again, of these Semitic peoples migrating from potentially Egypt or Canaan because of the Canaanite traditions. So that later evolved down into Israelite tradition, mythos, the whole deal. Again, we went through the origins of Canaan, lack of evidence. There's something that I find interesting, right? Is this, there's some anachronisms, right? That might be the later scribal updates as they compile all this work. So it also means that maybe this text wasn't written during that time period, but was then, again, that's probably where we get the 9th to 8th century time frame. Because it's like, oh, it didn't happen then, but we remember that, and we're going to add that in. Remember? Yeah. And then you get the later writing. So, long story short, the consensus would be it didn't happen as described. But the foundational myth that you get from the memories of the late Bronze Age collapse and the collective, willpower of these people is still really key. And, like I described before, like, story is important, right? It doesn't have to be this, like, oh, it's fact 110%, dude. It's like, it could just be something. It's a beacon of hope, right? The world's on fire at this time period. They need something, right? I mean, to me, that feels pretty compassionate. And yet, in our modern day, we don't have that same compassion for other people. It just kind of, well, one, I must hurt my feelings, but like, it should. Like, I don't understand, right? Sometimes when we get too locked into an idea, we hurt the people around us more than help them. And I don't think that's what they had in mind when they wrote this story down either. I don't know. I think that's a good place to end. But anyway, I just wanted to thank you. Right? We're going to be doing this a lot more. Hope you had fun. Hope I didn't ruffle your feathers. And again, if there's anything that I missed or anything you want to add, even a question, put it down below. Really. I want to hear it. I want to read it. I read all of them. And I respond to all of them. I want to make sure we can do this appropriately and share ideas appropriately and in a nice, fun, calm, rational space. Yeah, I think we can make that happen. All right, guys. Thank you. I will see you next week. Peace out. Keep seeking.